Dr. Erin Corrales-Diaz, welcome to the Bookshelf Conversations.
Hi.
So in honor of the event, I have hauled out my old Fort Wadsworth jersey, which I bought at some antique clothing store, must be at least 30 years ago. So the book is the iconic jersey, baseball, and pardon me, I'm old. How would you say, is it baseball times fashion or baseball X fashion?
It could be baseball times fashion, baseball and fashion, baseball by fashion. It's an interesting signifier that really indicates a collaboration or a relationship between baseball and fashion.
So this book is based on a recently closed exhibit at the Worcester, excuse me, the Worcester Art Museum or History Museum.
Yes, it closed about a month ago at Worcester. Yes.
So everything in this book, the catalog, these are actual exhibits that were at the museum itself. And I'm really sorry I missed it because it sounds like a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun to pull together. We had a great public response, and we were the first art museum to have such a project like this. So it was really an honor to work on this material and showcase it to a wide-ranging audience.
And of course, this is the year, I won't say after pandemic, because unfortunately pandemic is still with us. How is people must have been thrilled to be able to get out and go to the museums again.
Absolutely. This was our sort of first big exhibition since we were closed for about 6 months. And it was also done in conjunction with the move of the Boston Red Sox AAA affiliate to Worcester. So the city of Worcester constructed Polar Park Stadium. And this was a significant, just a major event for Worcester and for our city. And so working at WAM, at the Worcester Art Museum, as one of the cultural leaders in the city, we really wanted to, embrace this and do something to celebrate it. And of course, when we started this project, the pandemic wasn't here yet. So it really has taken on new meaning to sort of celebrate a citywide event around baseball. And so what was so fun and rewarding as a curator putting together an exhibition like this and is seeing folks go to the exhibition and then go to a Polar Park game. And they're all wearing their favorite jerseys. And that to me is really rewarding. And it's really gratifying to see a public response like that.
Now, you say you were working on this during the pandemic, so I guess it gave you a little extra time to piece together everything. How do you go about obtaining all of this stuff?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question, and it was complicated because of the pandemic. This was about two and a half years worth of work. A museum exhibition typically takes 3 to 5 years. So this
Wow.
was actually done on an accelerated timeline. And the reason for that was because we wanted to align the opening of the exhibition with the opening of Polar Park. So our timeline was really along the lines of the construction of the stadium. The Worcester Art Museum does not have a collection of baseball objects or artifacts, nor is this an area that we're going to be actively collecting it. That's just not an area where we really have the space or the wherewithal to sort of encompass, even though we are an encyclopedic institution. We cover all nationalities, cultures, and time periods. And so what I had done, and at the very beginnings of this project, I knew that I had to get the approval from the Baseball Hall of Fame. And so that was where I went to do my research. And for many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with going to the Hall of Fame and having that exciting moment of research and being able to be in the research center. And you go through and you ask for loans. So this was an entirely loaned exhibition, which is highly unusual. Usually exhibitions start with a few objects that an institution has in their permanent collections, but we didn't have that. So I reached out to the Hall of Fame. They lent us 10 jerseys, and the Smithsonian also lent us a couple. The rest were all through private lenders and a few smaller institutions that were local. The challenge of the pandemic, though, was working remotely. I like to see the objects in person before I ask for a loan. You know, it's one thing to see the image on a screen. It's a whole other thing when you get the opportunity to actually handle these garments, you know, and to see the difference, feel the difference between wool flannel and satin and polyester, right? You know, that's really monumental. So I had an opportunity to do that at the Hall of Fame and the Smithsonian, and then the pandemic started. And so I was, you know, kind of limited in terms of who I was able to reach out to. It was also a challenge at this particular point in time because a lot of museums were not actively lending their objects, or they were operating on a remote schedule. And so for someone like the Smithsonian, not only do curators need to sign off on a loan object, but your conservators need to go in and make sure that the object is safe to travel. So this was really quite complicated. And there was also one streetwear designer, Darren Romanelli, also known as Dr. X. He's based out of Los Angeles. He's this phenomenal streetwear designer. And he has an archive filled with all of his clothes that he has designed, but was unable to get into that archive because LA was under lockdown. So as a result, you know, the objects that were selected were somewhat skewed because of the pandemic and what I had access to. So I'm pretty proud of the fact that we were able to pull this off during this particular point in time.
Again, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to see it in person, but how many people typically would work on something in the museum? How many people would you have working on something like this? Because when you think about it, you have to decide what goes where, what goes next to each other, lighting, what the objects are enclosed in. Because I'm guessing, we'll talk about this a little more later. You mentioned satin jerseys. I imagine that must present some challenges in how you light it, or maybe not. Maybe it's easy to light it. And so, how many people would be working on something like this?
Oh, no, it's a great question. And it is a team-wide, a museum-wide effort. And so in my exhibition meetings that we would have, I mean, there could be up to 15 people, you know, that were working on that. We also had contract workers. So we hired a textile conservator to come in.
Excuse me one second. What is a conservator?
That's a great question. So this is someone who really deals with the care and the treatment of objects. And this can be anything from like an oil painting to a baseball jersey. And so there are conservators in a lot of different institutions. And so Worcester, we have a few conservators. We have a paintings conservator, you know, an objects conservator, but we didn't have a textile conservator. And textile is, you know, has its own concerns and challenges. And so we really felt, because of, in some cases, the historic nature of the garments that we were borrowing from the Hall of Fame, to sort of the cultural significance of some of the others, like the Rocket Man suit from Paramount Pictures, that we wanted to hire someone who had particular expertise in handling garments. And so we brought in a textile conservator, and she had a team of 3, and they, in a few cases, they made a few repairs to objects. So the Kalamazoo Lassies uniform that was in the exhibition, that underwent a little bit of treatment. It had a few tears that were repaired and a few loose strings that were taken off. But they also had to construct the mounts that these were on as well. And in some cases, we had to outsource some of the hardware to individuals as well. So it's an extensive endeavor, and it's so much more than just simply selecting the objects. It's working with an exhibition design team, a conservation team. You have to work with a team to handle the objects, put the objects on the mount, put them in the case, light them, put up what we call, didactics, any sort of text, the individual labels, overarching labels, and dealing with all of the loans having all of that paperwork in place to understand and figure out when objects are being moved from, say, the Hall of Fame to Worcester, having people on site to do that, handling opening up crates. I mean, it's pretty extensive. And then adding on top of that, producing a catalog also involves more people because you're dealing with image rights and an editorial process and so forth. So it was an extensive endeavor. Yeah.
And that explains why it takes so long, because I'm certainly not an avid museum goer. So I get a new appreciation of exactly how much goes into this. So it does sound like a daunting process. Talking about the book here. So it's basically three chapters, the modern jersey, experimental design, and off the field. One of the things I thought of when looking at the off the field is, well, not so much the off the field. Let's back up a little bit. When would you say was the point where fans started wearing this stuff? Because looking at the old pictures, looking at the people in the stadium, they might have worn hats,
Yep.
because hats are practical. I mean, you need a hat to keep the sun out of your eyes, to keep your head warm or cool. Excuse me. But when did they start wearing the team's paraphernalia?
That is a great question. And that was kind of one of the big aha or surprise moments for me in working on this, is to realize and to figure out when fans began to wear replica jerseys to games, and then subsequently, outside of the stadium and so forth. And so this is, taking place in the mid to late 70s to early 80s. And what I found to be so exciting in this particular project was I found fan made or handmade baseball jerseys, because it really wasn't until sort of the late 70s, early 80s that fans could go to a team shop to buy a jersey. That just wasn't the case. So if you wanted a jersey, if you wanted to wear your team allegiance literally on your sleeves, you would have to create it yourself. And I had always heard about this, someone like Todd Radom, who's a renowned sports graphic designer, he told me, as a child, he had a screen print kit and he made his own. But of course I asked him, I was like, well, do you have this garment? I would love to have it. This is like really important to have the visual object in addition to the story account. And no, these are things that most people don't hang on to. But I found someone. I found Larry Wentz's collection. So Larry Wentz used to work with Peter Capliano of Mitchell and Ness, who was a traveling salesman, and he loved baseball. And he had a large family. And so he made his children jerseys. He just took Hanes t-shirts and used magic markers, and eventually he'd upgrade to acrylic paints and used baseball cards as his model. But he made these jerseys, and so the children would wear these going to games. And so there's been photographs of the Wentz children, in a Phillies game wearing these garments. And so to me, that was really exciting, because that really propels the jersey into a realm of more popular culture, right? And it's really propelled through the fans. The fans have normalized this in a way that someone like a hip hop star could now begin to wear a jersey. So actually finding those garments was really exciting. And one of the great things about working on this project was many of the members of the Wentz family were able to come and see their dad's garments hanging in the exhibition, and they see their dad listed as the artist on the label. It was really exciting for them to be able to see their work, to see this work, to see their dad's work being recognized as an art form. So
You mentioned before repairing one of the tunics from the All-American Girls Baseball League. And in the book, you do mention Ebbets Field Flannels, which is a company that produces vintage jerseys, hats. This is one of their hats.
excellent.
And I know in the movies, especially more recently, they really try to be as precise as possible when using materials to create the costumes of the day. So I'm wondering, when it came to repairing that particular item, do you use I guess you kind of have to use what's available now. You can't go back to like 60 years ago to try to find the thread that was used for those
Right.
particular uniforms.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good question. So yeah, it is using modern materials, but conservators do extensive research on, the kinds of the old materials. What was the garment made out of? What was the quality of the thread and so forth that was being used? That would all help dictate what kind of a modern equivalent you would use. What's also really important in the field of conservation is to allow for any sort of change or repair to be relatively easily reversible. And this is because we don't really know, technology changes all the time. This is certainly more of a case when you're dealing with sort of paintings and objects, but the same thing really also stands for textiles too, is to make sure that there is some sort of reversibility. It's also extensively documented, so future conservators, future owners of those objects will know what had occurred. So it was the Lassie's jersey that had a bit of repair work, and then the Spencer jersey as well. We didn't have a chance to have it photographed in its brand new condition, but we removed a stain on that garment as well. And in some cases, stains are really tricky. This is an interesting case where if an object was game worn, having those sweat stains and the dirt stains, I mean, that gives the garment a level of aura that is so important to baseball collectors, right? And to me, when I'm thinking about these objects, it is part of its story, it's part of its history. And so there's always a push-pull. Do you keep those in that condition, or do you try to clean that up and repair that? In a lot of cases, we didn't have to deal with it because it was a loaned object, but I was working on this project when Hank Aaron passed away, and we had a Hank Aaron jersey in the exhibition. And to see some of those sweat and stain marks is just, it was really monumental. It was really moving to sort of see that essentially an imprint of the human on that garment. So yeah, so it's a really interesting question about when do you intervene, and then what kind of materials that you use. But someone like Ebbets Field and Mitchell and Ness, they have really expanded, I think, our awareness of the construction of some of these garments due to their research.
One of the excuse me, things that has become popular for collectors in recent years, of course, baseball cards have been with us for 100 years, since the beginning of baseball. But they include on some cards tiny swatches of game worn uniforms that are I don't know how they do it, but it's in the card
Yeah.
itself, and that seems to be the idea that people would want that tiny little bit. I imagine if you had a favorite player like a Hank Aaron or something, it'd be
Yeah.
especially meaningful. Just the other night, I saw a commercial for bats produced by some company for Derek Jeter and Larry Walker, who were inducted in the Hall of Fame. And I found it. I was feeling a little sorry for Larry Walker because the Derek Jeter bat was $20 more than the Walker bat. So we know where they are in the hierarchy of the history of the game. Which, by the way, we should mention that the history of baseball in Worcester goes back to the 19th century. So it's not some Johnny come lately site that's trying to take advantage of the popularity. And speaking of popularity, I have here a book that you mentioned in yours, Baseball Uniforms of the 20th Century by Mark O'Conan. Now, this book came out 30 years ago. So it has approximately 250 pages. That is before you have this situation where teams have so many variations on the uniform. I don't know if it was the Kansas City Athletics or the Pittsburgh Pirates who started mixing and matching tops and bottoms.
The
And it
athletics,
just
yeah.
becomes, and teams seem to change uniforms much more often than they used to. And I don't know, the cynic in me says it's a money grab because they'll make it available to the fans, and the fans will want to have every little thing. So they will go out and buy all this stuff. I particularly thought of that. I was watching a Yankee Red Sox game, and the Red Sox were wearing their yellow uniforms. And that,
Yeah.
as a traditionalist, why are the Red Sox wearing yellow uniforms? And I asked about this, and it was explained to me that these are a special set of community-based uniforms, and the yellow is supposed to represent the Boston Marathon, I believe. The colors of the Boston Marathon made perfect sense. But again, the cynic in me, well, okay, here's another thing I have to buy now because I'm a fan of the team. So that's just again the cynic in me. Uh, the section on experimental designs includes the satin uniforms, which we mentioned. Talk a little bit about how those came about.
Yeah, so these reached a level of popularity among just a handful of teams, actually, in sort of the mid 40s. And this came about because ballparks were being outfitted with artificial lighting and would allow for nighttime games. And so that cynic in you kind of comes back with the satin jerseys, because it was sort of a pull to make these nighttime games really attractive and, in a way, a spectacle. So satin was selected due to its reflective nature, and it was thought that the satin jerseys, and it wasn't just the jerseys, it was also pants. So it's a full-on satin uniform and a hat, right? So that these were meant to better illuminate the players and would allow spectators to see the game better. So there was a reason there, but they weren't necessarily very effective, and the players hated them because they did not breathe. So in terms of perspiration and player comfort, they were not at the top of the heap. You know, just envision wearing head to toe satin in a night game in August. You know, that's just not great, you know, under bright artificial lighting. So this was it was a very short-lived endeavor, and I was lucky to find a Boston Braves jersey that was on loan to us from the Hall of Fame. That was satin. So yeah, so that's great. And one of my favorite bits when I was researching these garments is I would do a lot of primary source research, you know, going into newspaper accounts and reading about when each team would unveil their new uniforms, right? And when the satin uniforms were debuted, critics hated them. They despised them too. So not only was it the players that really didn't like it because of the comfort, but it was also the commentary of the sports critics talking about these, calling them pajamas, or saying that they were akin to something that you would see in a lingerie shop. You know, it was amazing. So I love reading that criticism. And it comes up again and again, talking about the change in baseball uniforms, the change of design, the change in fashion is mentioned more and more than what you would think for, you know. So that was always really fun as a researcher and an archivist, you know, to go in and to find those accounts.
And of course, you always hear about how horrible the flannels were to wear in those
Exactly.
uniforms. And then even later on in the 70s, when they started going to polyester, players would complain about that too. But I think at that point, it became a lot about how the uniform looked on the player, because you hear about how skin tight these things were and how it'd be attractive to the female fans to see the players so and clothed. Uh, let's go back, talk about the uniforms for the All-American Girls Leagues. I remember the famous scene in A League of Their Own where the model comes out on top of the dugout and she's wearing the uniform, and they say that's not a uniform, that's half a uniform, that's a dress. What I'm sure in the time in the 40s there was a lot of sexist design in that they wanted to show off these women. But practically speaking, I mean, there's another scene where a woman slides in and gets this giant strawberry, pardon me, for mixing my fruits. That couldn't have been very comfortable for a lot of these women to wear.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I had it in the experimental section, because to me it's a garment that is really ineffective. for playing baseball. You know, in the 40s and the early 50s, men were wearing jerseys and pants, and women were in these tunic style dresses. They would wear um, like satin shorts underneath, which actually, going back to those satin jerseys, one of the accounts that I found was that apparently the idea for a satin uniform came from watching the women's baseball players and seeing the satin reflect off of their shorts. Now, is that true or not? Not entirely sure, but it was a really interesting account. But I had the opportunity to meet some of the former players in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. They came to this exhibition. Mabel Blair was there, and we talked about wearing this uniform. And she said, absolutely, I still have gravel stuck in my thighs, you know, from sliding, you know, that these were just not effective to playing the sport. And yet, for so many of these women, they were so just excited to even play, you know. And what I have in the exhibition is also another garment worn by a female baseball player, Jody Howler. She played college ball for St. Vincent. And what's really great is you look at her jersey, and there is nothing about it that would indicate that it was worn by a female player, you know. And so it's because of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, those women taking that step to wear this garment that was impractical, that was really quite sexist, that would allow for future female baseball players to not even have to think that about their uniform and just simply play the sport.
And it would be remiss of me not to mention that the Chicago White Sox at one point wore shorts. Either in the late 70s or early 80s, I was thumbing through the O'Conan book trying to find, because in this book, and I think this is available now on Baseball Reference, they will have for every year depictions of each team's home and away uniforms. And now I'm thinking of this book, like I said, it's 250 pages. I imagine it would be at least twice as large now, because to represent all of the different variations. So I can't imagine that the White Sox would have been very thrilled to be sliding around in shorts, and that short-lived experiment. You also have these sleeveless uniforms that were made popular. I always thought it was the Reds, the Cincinnati Reds, because of Ted Kluszewski, who was very muscular, and he would wear the tunic without any undershirt on it, just to show off his massive arms. But
Right.
I think I always thought it was a handsome uniform, and I was particularly attracted. There's even though it doesn't sound very good, a lot of teams had turned back the clock, where they would wear uniforms
Yeah.
of maybe the Negro Leagues, maybe a Hispanic team, or just their own teams way back in time. But there was also a brief experiment with turn ahead the clock instead of
Yeah.
turn the clock ahead. I thought some of those were very spiffy. The Seattle Mariners jersey, popularized by Ken Griffey Jr. I was actually looking for some of those on eBay, and those are tremendously expensive.
Yeah. Oh, it's such a fascinating period. And for someone who grew up outside of Seattle, so I'm a Seattle Mariners fan, like Ken Griffey Jr. is sort of like hometown hero along with Edgar Martinez and so forth. So I remembered, you know, those uniforms. And the jersey that was in the exhibition and is in the book is from when the Mariners started this trend in 1998. And it was just for one time. And this was a case where the development and marketing team worked really closely with the players. Ken Griffey Jr. had a significant hand in sort of shaping and propelling the design of the garment, which I think is really interesting. You don't often have a player being able to sort of voice what they're interested in and having that really be manifested. And it's interesting that you bring this up also in conversation with the sleeveless jerseys, because you have in the late 90s sort of a reemergence of, or sort of a variation of that sleeveless vest that you would see that the Pirates or the Reds would be wearing, you know. So this moment in 1998 when the Mariners had this turn ahead the clock, you know, uniform, it was so popular that the MLB paid attention to it and decided to make it a league-wide option. And so this is where you get like the Mets and the Phillies, and they went all out. So the Mets, you know, it was envisioning what if it was on like another planet. You know, the Phillies had more stars on the US flag, things along those lines. And what's interesting is that the Boston Red Sox had designed a uniform, had designed a jersey, but it never made it in time to Boston so that they could wear it. It was during there was a hurricane, and it really stopped the shipment. And so what's really interesting is no one knows where those garments are. I've talked to the curator at the Boston Red Sox. Most ball teams and ballparks happen to have their own dedicated curators. And so talking to the Red Sox, where is this? You know, it'd be really great to have this. And no one knows. So somewhere out there is a box of these.
Turning back to the mid to late 19th century, looking in the book, the uniforms were very fancy. They
Yes.
and at some point, I'm wondering where was the divide between where it became that fancy. Of course, the game was designed in those days for gentlemen,
Exactly.
for the upper middle class, rather than everybody. The great democratic game it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
When did it turn? Like I'm thinking it was because I'm thinking of the New York Giants black checkered uniforms
Mm.
of the early 1900s. So I'm guessing it must have been like the 1920s when it started taking on the design that we're familiar with today.
Exactly. 1920s and 1930s. So it really is, you know, sort of this mid 20th century moment. So, but yeah, it goes from extremely fancy, you know, as you said, gentlemanly like, and of course the design of the uniform was meant to reflect that. So ties or the bib or the shield front, really elaborate Gothic initials. And then it moves into something that's more simplified, right? So that's where
Excuse
you
me,
get,
pardon me for interrupting, but the
yeah.
bibs were reflective of fire departments, I understand.
Yes, fire department or your local militia. And what's interesting, and again, I'm really interested in how these things were purchased and so forth. So, you know, in the catalog, so in the book, there is a broadside, a really large advertisement by Peck and Snyder, who was really the 19th century provider for sporting manufacturing goods before Spalding. And you see on this spread, there's different colors of stockings and so forth, but then you've got a fireman's uniform and then a baseball uniform, and they're essentially identical, right? And so as a manufacturer, you're essentially using one pattern, but you can change the color, right? So it was a really easy way to sort of speak to both of those. It also was a way to hearken to those fraternal organizations, such as a fireman's brigade or a militia, that also elevates that level of respectability. Um, and so yeah, so it was really interesting to sort of see that where it's coming from and where it's starting, and then yeah, it becomes much more streamlined, much more simplified. You know, in the 19th century, you open up a Spalding guide to see what the options were to purchase a uniform. You would have a variety of different collars. You could do, you know, a button. You could do a lace. You could have the bib. You could have a variety of different scripts or letter forms. And by the 1920s, 1930s, you really get a much more streamlined approach to uniforms, where it's what we think of today as a baseball uniform. It's the short sleeved, the button down appearance.
One of the things I appreciate is that we're watching, especially watching the playoffs now. I'm thinking about how some teams really haven't changed that much. The Cardinals, the Dodgers, the Yankees, of course, uh, the Giants. I mean, the older teams seem to have maintained where you would think they might want to change. Like some of the teams change frequently.
Yes.
I'm thinking about the rainbow pattern for the
The
Astros,
Astros.
which didn't
Yeah.
last too long. But you would think that in order to be more approachable to the younger fans, that they might want to become a little more modern, a little more. But some of these are just classic. and won't change. And that makes me jump ahead now to modern times and the use of the baseball jersey as fashion. You mentioned hip hop stars before, and I wonder how many people who buy this attire now are doing it because of baseball or because of their hip hop heroes.
Yeah, exactly. It's an interesting case to just see, this whole book and the exhibition is thinking about that cultural significance of the baseball jersey in the sports, in the everyday life, and even on like the runway at like fashion week and so forth. But yeah, it is an interesting case is once the jersey has become so popularized, so normalized by fans that the fans are wearing replica jerseys not only to ball games but just out in everyday life, to represent their team, that it suddenly becomes a bit more commonplace. And then when you get someone like, Jay-Z wearing his Yankees jersey, is it hearkening to the Yankees? Is it hearkening to one's pride in one's team or one's city, one's region? Or is it showing a kind of allegiance to Jay-Z and 1990s hip hop? It's particularly interesting to sort of think about when is one's entry point into the history or the emergence of the baseball jersey. And I think it varies for different people, which is what was also exciting about this project, is it allows for a lot of different access points to then think more critically about baseball and its role in fashion and in everyday life.
Because I'm thinking there might be some people who wear these jerseys who have absolutely no love for baseball at all.
Right, exactly. And then you'll get like designers, someone like Gucci, who is making their own garments that will say like Gucci on the back. It has absolutely nothing to do with sort of a historic team or anything along those lines. But it has to do with representing the particular brand. It's really about a brand identity, but that they have settled upon the baseball jersey as a really versatile and effective means of communication, which is something that I find really interesting. The style of a baseball jersey is so recognizable that it translates from team to team to then to brand, in these kinds of ways. We also have in more popular culture, so someone like Ebbets Field, who is actively researching and creating garments for the minor leagues, for the Negro Leagues and so forth, that they are bringing a greater awareness to some of those periods of history. And so it's a huge decision about what jersey you're going to wear. You really carefully thought about what you were going to put on today, in our conversation, so do you wear a replica jersey of a contemporary player? Do you wear a jersey of a Hall of Famer? Do you wear a jersey from a team that's now defunct? These are interesting questions that people face. And it really indicates that when you put on a garment, how personal it is, because it's conveying something to the world about who you are and who you want to be.
A few years ago, my wife and I were in London for a trip, and we went to Harrods, and she was looking in her section. I was looking in mine. I went to the men's department, and I was shocked to see on display uh, some baseball jerseys for the Boston Red Sox and the Tokyo Giants. That's all they had. They were tremendously expensive. Uh, they were not traditional. They were not the traditional pinstripes or plain that they were like stylized. They're fashionable. So and I do remember that the Yankees and Red Sox, I believe it was those two teams, actually played in England a few years ago to try to spread baseball around the world, which is something Spalding did way back. Is
Exactly.
took a bunch of all stars on a trip around the world, where there's a famous photograph of them standing on the Sphinx, I believe, or at the
Yep.
pyramids, and they
Yeah.
went to England and met King George. It was very fascinating. So we have been talking today with Dr. Erin Corrales-Diaz, curator of this wonderful exhibit. And if those of you who haven't had a chance to be there in person, highly recommend the book. if you're into art or baseball or fashion, whatever. Thank you so much for talking with us today, Erin.
Thank you, Ron.